Hi there. My name is Matt Furness, and this is The Culture Hack, a video and podcast series that captures experiences and life lessons from those who know culture best. The goal? To help you to understand, design, and change your company culture. Thanks for tuning in. Hi, everybody, and welcome to The Culture Hack. It's Matt Furness here from Click Culture Consulting, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Yasmine Alani. So Yasmine is the head of creative learning, DEI, and culture at MediaZoo. She's an award-winning learning professional, so she's won gold in both Learning Professional of the Year and the Rising Star categories of the Learning Awards. I'm really looking forward to talking to her today. Welcome, Yasmine.
Thanks,
Thank you
Matt.
so
It's a
much for
pleasure to
coming on.
be here.
So we'll be talking today about your views and your expertise and your experience on all things company culture. But just before we go there, it would be good to just step back and hear a little bit more about your story and your background.
Absolutely. I think I've had what is known in the industry as a squiggly career. But one thing that has always bound me to everything is my passion for people. It's been something that has been evident since a really, really early age. I remember kind of as a child being involved in various different campaigns and kind of marches, and I was just so interested in clearly fighting for a better world at that time, although that's not what I understood it to be at that time. I just obviously felt a really innate sense of the right thing to do, much to my mother's kind of confusion. I don't think she understood why I was getting involved in things that, as far as she was concerned, didn't kind of align to me. But I think now, as an adult, it makes sense. It kind of led me initially to a career in law. So I originally trained as a barrister, was only interested in doing family law, was not really kind of interested in doing anything else. And then when I did kind of start to practice, started to very quickly see that it wasn't the law that I loved, it was the interaction with the human beings and trying to kind of fight for justice for them and understanding the psychology of them. So I did that for a bit, but then needed to kind of get out of that and change careers. So I kind of ended up in finance, working for one of the regulators in London, which was only supposed to be a stopgap that allowed me to kind of move to London and kind of live here. Ended up being there for 6 years. As most stopgaps kind of tend to be, they go on a little bit longer than you want them to. But what was brilliant about that opportunity is I was able to um, really try my hand at kind of different things within such a huge organization, and spent a lot of time working actually with the learning and development team, running my own training, designing kind of coaching and mentoring programs, and absolutely fell in love with it. So after a short career break to kind of really go to the other side of the world and figure out what I wanted to do, I ended up in learning and development and working for a really large corporate media organization for 4 years, and moved from learning and development quite quickly into this middle space between learning and development and DEI, because I was there during the start of the pandemic, and also in 2020, the murder of George Floyd, where businesses and organisations were really starting to sit up, obviously far too late, but really thinking about what are we doing as an organisation for diversity and inclusion. So I was very much involved in that, and I think that's where my interest in kind of culture more widely came. I started to become, a bit of an expert in both fields of learning and development and diversity and inclusion. And for kind of my work in that space, that's when, as you said, I was really humbled to win the Rising Star of the Year award, which then led me to go and work at MediaZoo and in an agency for the first time. And I've been there for about 3 years now, working on large scale transformation programs, really trying to help clients understand their diversity and inclusion kind of gaps and creating programs in place as well. So yeah, a potted history of quite a squiggly career, but when I look back on it, it makes sense to how I got to where I am today.
Makes sense. Love that. So, yeah, what I find interesting when I speak to people on this show is just how many people have had these really interesting squiggly careers, And when you know A and B, so like law and head of DEI, you sort of go, how have you made that jump? But then when you describe it, it sort of starts to make sense, and the underlying passion has been the
Absolutely, yeah.
same all this time. So in terms of what you're doing now then, so it sounds like you're working on these sort of large scale transformation programs. I'm really curious when it comes to, I guess, the people side of those transformation programs and shaping sort of the culture which can either help or hinder the transformation that business is trying to affect. What have been, I guess, the most stubborn challenges or things that keep coming up time and time again?
I mean, there are so many, more than we could possibly go on in the time that we have. But my approach to transformation is always trying to bring that human-centric lens back to whatever we're doing. Because what I tend to find is whatever we're doing, we're working with people, and human beings, we're not logical, and we're emotional, and we can be irrational. And, we hear time and time again about things like the change curve. And what I tend to see a lot is people forgetting that when they're trying to make anyone do anything. Make was in inverted quotes there for anyone listening on the podcast. So it's leaders uh, perhaps reacting maybe quite violently to the idea of change. I think we were talking about a story just before, weren't we, Matt, about a really defining moment in my journey into kind of culture work was when I was working in London. I was working in a really large corporate media organization, and I was running a training program about unconscious bias and privilege and diversity and inclusion to some very, very senior leaders. And it was all going kind of pretty well until I started to make the connection between kind of privilege and unconscious bias, and how we can start to default unconsciously to the same voices, people that look like us, people that sound like us, because that felt familiar. And really distinctly remember the most senior person in that room, who happened to be CEO of quite a large radio station, really kicking off in that session. I mean, to the point where it ran the session to a halt. We were only halfway through. I obviously had like another hour and a half to go of that session. Put in a complaint, following that session, about how much of a waste of time it was, and kind of raised it to HR. And those things that I was trying to communicate in my mind were just things that people should be more aware of. But he took it as such a personal attack. And I think that was and that's not the first time things have happened like that since, but it really opened my eyes to how, especially with diversity and inclusion work, when you're trying to do culture change in that space, there's almost like another layer of protection that people put around themselves. So not only do we have the difficulty where we're trying to make people change behaviors and trying to kind of shift their thinking anyway in a cultural shift space, but with diversity and inclusion, there's almost that level of, it feels like a personal attack. It feels like you're being told that you're not a good person, or you are purposefully excluding people, or you're purposefully marginalizing people. So I think that's one of the largest challenges that I come up with time and time again. It's trying to understand how people are going to react to being told what on the surface of it feels like a seemingly just kind of almost like a factual thing. We're talking about science here, we're talking about biology. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's almost like their own, either their ego or their own personal beliefs, motives, understanding of the world are sort of getting in the way. I'm really curious about that example, because it must have felt, traumatic's a really strong word, right? But if you're a more junior member of staff, you are delivering a session, and your boss's boss or boss's boss's boss is now saying this is a waste of time, lodges a complaint. That must have hit home, right? So what I'm curious about is two things. One is, how did you respond to that? And two is, if you could go back in time and respond again,
Yeah,
what would you
great
have done
questions. I
differently?
think about that situation a lot, obviously. What was in our favour at that particular time, what was in my favour, is I had run that session to a few other groups of similar seniority. And actually, but this is a lesson within itself, the people that I was most scared about running it to, like the chief legal officer, like the, chief operating officer, those were the people that I really thought they are the ones that are going to have a problem with it. And actually, their feedback was really good. They felt that they took a lot out of the session. So luckily, because I'd run it, was this wasn't the first session that I'd run, because I think I might have just quit on the spot, to be honest. I kind of had that in my camp already, that I knew that the session was good, and I knew that people who I believed might have been more of a tricky customer had, assimilated that information, and also, was able to discuss it with my team kind of afterwards. I sat kind of in the learning and development team, but as part of wider HR. So there were some investigations into it, but I was told kind of very early doors that this, we kind of expected this to happen, and this kind of isn't on you. So that was really helpful. I had a really great team around me at that time, but it was really intimidating. But I think actually, when I think back to it, it made me even more passionate about doing this work. I'm still in it, so obviously it didn't deter me too much. It just made me realize that there has to be a delicacy when you're trying to dismantle really, really widely kind of held beliefs, or perhaps you focus a little bit more on the behavior change part than the attitudes and the beliefs, which I know is something that Matt, you
Yeah.
are a really kind of strong proponent of as well. So a lot of learning that happened in a really short space of time, because of that event.
Yeah. There's a couple of lessons just to summarize that I heard there. So one lesson for me is don't assume you know how someone will respond to whatever it is that you're doing. So it was interesting that those senior leaders who you thought were going to be skeptics actually sort of they were on board with it, and I think that was quite an interesting lesson. And also a lesson that I heard in there you were talking about was look at the whole evidence and how lots of people are responding, not just one person. It's easy to get hung up on the views of one person, especially if they are someone like the CEO. I get that, but I like that. You mentioned being delicate with the messaging around this stuff because of people's emotional investment. If you could go back in time and you could replay that conversation with the CEO, so you could alter what it was that you were saying, do you think there would have been a way to land your message in perhaps a way that would have perhaps it would have landed better with him? The reason I ask is because I imagine people listening in will be talking to people who are skeptics and who are emotionally invested, and they are sort of tiptoeing around it. So they need to have the conversation. They want to have a delicate conversation so they don't fly off the handle. So if you could go back in time, is there a way you might approach that conversation in which you could sort of nail the delicacy, or do you think you would have the conversation in a similar way?
What I would definitely do if I could do it again actually would not be necessarily alter the content of the training, but I would have had an individual conversation with that person before the training. Actually, what I would have done is I would have had a 20-minute conversation with the most senior person that was going to be in that room, because what I didn't realize, which perhaps is like very obvious, especially to people that work in the cultural sector, but I was very junior at the time, the power that they have in terms of groupthink and people defaulting to that, that tone is immediate. And like I said, it was like the entire training session post that moment just completely changed, because everyone had almost gone, oh, well, if he doesn't believe in this, then we're not going to believe in it. And it could have been it literally
Mm,
just turned on that. So I might not have changed what I said in the content of the session, but I definitely would have had a 15-20 minute conversation up front before to say, this is what we're going to
mm.
cover. I'm really interested to hear where your views are on it, and also get their buy-in into, how do you think
Yeah,
we can
nice.
land these messages, and how do you think we can get your team on board, so they're really feeling like they're co-creating the solution. Because probably to that person, what it felt like was just a bit of an ambush in the session. And I think that's
Mm,
something that I kind of take forward in the work I do now. And I'm sure you feel similar things when we're talking about culture and culture shift and culture change. Really, the impact of the messaging that comes from the leadership and the top down is
mm,
huge. It really, I've
mm.
read studies about people mimicking kind of the way that the CEO walks and talks, subconsciously, because the
Yeah,
amount of
yeah,
influence they have. People look to that leadership to kind of dictate what they should be thinking, not in a sheep way, just in a, that's how we're kind of programmed.
yeah,
So
yeah,
getting leaders on board in whatever way you can is one of the cornerstones of making anything you do a success.
yeah. It's a really nice top tip, to get that buy-in and just have a conversation with the people whose voices carry the most weight in the room before you go in, because that it's almost setting yourself up to make sure that they don't have that reaction in the room. It's
Mm,
why what we do is really hard, because this stuff is nuanced, and I really like the
mm,
word you use, like it's delicate. It is really quite delicate. So that is a really good, or, or it's a story that where you know things didn't go as you envisaged and it sort of taught you something. What about on the flip side? So I'd love to hear about some initiatives or efforts around DEI and culture that you've
mm.
been really proud of.
I It's both a story and also perhaps a message, because the I think what can be really off-putting about culture work and DEI work is the vastness of it. It feels so big and it feels so overwhelming and it feels impossible to change, that often people really shy away from doing it. And what I like to encourage people to do is start small. Think about the things that you want to change and try and pinpoint what are the, almost like the easiest shifts, what are the smallest things that you can do, what are the um, things that are going to create impact, but you don't need to change kind of everything overnight, right? So one of the challenges I'd faced in a previous organization was, it was a huge organization, but it almost kind of had lots of different businesses under it. Obviously, it was all part of the same organization, but it was almost like you were, as a business partner, you were working with multiple different, it was like being in an agency, I guess, because all of your clients were, they felt like clients that were kind of different. And it was a big complaint about the culture of the organization, that it just felt so siloed. And that meant that people couldn't um, kind of be cross promoted into different divisions. It meant that there was a huge retention problem, because people would leave the company with a huge amount of talent, rather than be able to be cross promoted and whatever. And that's a huge thing. That's a huge thing to take on. But actually, one of the ways that I tackled that was to create a cross divisional mentoring program that was like a self-serve program. And it just allowed anyone who wanted to be a mentor, and I really believe that anyone could be a mentor, because everyone has got a unique experience, everyone's got a unique kind of approach to the working world, everyone's got something to teach someone. I don't really like the term reverse mentoring, maybe that's a bit controversial, but it kind of insinuates that you can only be a mentor if you're really, really senior. Whereas I just think of mentorship as, what have you got to teach somebody else? Um, so set up a mentoring program where anybody from any division could apply to be mentored by any other person. Because I also really see the value in people wanting to be mentored by people that kind of look and feel like them, rather than oh, that's the position that I want to get. So, for example, people like me who are ethnic minority women, I might want to be mentored by an ethnic minority female. They might be in a completely different industry to me, but actually, what I want to learn from them is how they've navigated the world, you know, given their history, given their background, given their ethnicity, and what current mentoring programs we're doing in that organization. We're only allowing people to be mentored by people within that division. So, if you're in finance, for example, and you were a young female, your choices were probably white men, you know, because of the time. So just by instilling that cross-divisional mentoring program, we saw so much cross collaboration. We saw more cross promotion. You know, people maybe in finance, they had a mentor in marketing, and then all of a sudden opportunities kind of were opened up for that. And it was just a small kind of thing that it was very kind of grassroots, and it was done on like Excel spreadsheets, and it wasn't fancy at all. But I think just getting out there and doing something like that, I'm so much prouder of something like that, which is feels a lot smaller than kind of the bigger things, because it is that message of start small. You can make an impact even if you're doing something that doesn't feel like it's going to make an impact.
I really like that. I think what I see a lot of is more and more tech that is used for, I don't know, mentoring or democratizing coaching or an LMS, or like more and more tech is coming to HR. But what I love is with a sturdy Excel file, you've been able to do something that works. And there are, obviously, I'm not being derogatory towards that tech, like there are times when you need it, right? But I really like that idea of you don't need to invest huge amounts of time, money and effort in order to start making changes. And just simply by pairing people up from across the business and giving people freedom in who they're choosing as their mentors, you've allowed people to get advice, mentorship from people that they want to get advice and mentorship from. And then the byproduct of that is more relationships, more cross promotions, breaking down silos. So I really like that as an example. So we've obviously just picked out a high and a low in this conversation, and I'm sure there'll be plenty of things in between. I'd love to know, if you've been working in this field for a few years now, if you could go back in time and you could talk to yourself 10 years ago, what's the advice that you would give yourself about all things people, culture, and DEI?
Probably just because you see it a certain way, and it's really, I always say that I do what I do because it's the right thing to do. That's what drives me more than anything. It's making a change for people in a space that is so crucial. It's so important. I sometimes struggle with any other argument other than, but that's what's right. But that isn't how everyone thinks, and that doesn't make them bad people. And I think if I had been more okay with that a lot earlier on, it would have saved me a lot of stress, and also helped me think a bit more strategically about how I approach things. Because I think I just made things a lot harder for myself, because I was kind of like, really belligerent and like just, really wanting people to see my point of view. And I think that comes from being a barrister a little bit. You're sort of preconditioned. Yeah, exactly.
I was going to say,
you should speak to my partner. It's an absolute nightmare for him. But I think, almost not being smart with how you get people on board. And actually, to go back to what we were talking about previously, these things are delicate, and I speak to a lot of people, especially like diversity and inclusion consultants, that feel so burnt out because they are giving so much of themselves all the time to something that they don't feel like they're seeing loads of change in. And I completely get that. And I think statistically people don't stay in the diversity and inclusion space for a really, really, really long time, because they kind of get despondent, and they get upset with kind of the lack of results. But I think the
Mm-hmm.
more that we can bring the conversation back to, you are trying to move that iceberg of, you know, the stuff that you can't see under the surface. And just because you have a certain view about something or why someone wouldn't be doing something, you just have to get a little bit more in the mindset of that person, and actually make your life easier for yourself a little bit. Like, go with the understanding of maybe what that person's priority is, rather than trying to persuade them from your point of view. I think I also,
Mm.
to add on to that, think that we tend to believe, because of authority bias, that leaders kind of know all the things and they have all the answers. But in the culture space,
Mm.
I would say that is less. They have the least knowledge than any other
Yeah.
population, and that's because they actually don't have as much connection to what's kind of happening at lower levels in the culture. So it is your responsibility, if you're working in this space, to educate as well as to do the job that you're doing.
Mm.
It's to educate, and to educate from the point of view of their lens rather than from your lens.
Mm. It's almost like
Absolutely.
meeting them where they are. Um, so you said a minute ago that there are a lot of sort of DEI professionals out there who you think are feeling quite despondent and quite, burnt out, and perhaps they're frustrated with the lack of impact. Perhaps they are one of those people who are spending 1 to 3 years in the industry and then leaving. If any of those people were listening, what would you want to say to them?
I have an unbelievable amount of compassion, you know, because the reality is it's a disproportionately high number of people who work in the diversity and inclusion space that are people from minoritized groups. So it almost, somehow there was this decision somewhere that it was like, if you want to change something, you've kind of got to fight for it yourself, you know. And that, you know, going back to kind of you know, our first conversation about things being feeling very personal, they are also very personal to that diversity and inclusion consultant, because they're not only trying to shift things for an organization, they're carrying all of that trauma themselves. Of, you know, they've probably got into that industry because of experiences that they had, experiences they saw their parents having. You know, I always talk about, I'm of mixed heritage background. My father's from the Middle East and my mom's from Serbia. And you know, both came here as immigrants, and I grew up watching them, and you know, the racism that they had to face, and obviously two countries also that have been at war, like within our lifetimes as well, and all of the awful kind of stories that are peddled by the media, and people's kind of just stereotypes of people from that country. You know, I watch any film and the mafia person is from Serbia. You watch any, you know, you play any kind of computer game and the people that you're attacking are, you know, terrorists from the Middle East. You know, it's a real ingrained bias into our country, and that fuels kind of my, I never want anyone to feel in the workplace like my parents did in the workplace when they were kind of working in the 80s and 90s here. So I think if you're coming at it from that background, and certainly a lot of DEI consultants are
Mm.
coming it with their personal experiences and what they are trying to change, it just feels so much more crushing. So, I mean, what I have said to
Yeah.
a lot of my friends that work in that space is, like, it sounds really trite, but make sure you are looking after your own mental health. Like, that has to be priority number one. And if things aren't changing as quickly as you want them to, that is not a personal reflection on you. That is not a failing on yourself. And I think that's the level that a lot of people kind of take it at. It's just, we have to find that middle ground between not just being kind of complacent that, oh, things take a long time to change, so let's not worry about it, but also not beating ourselves up when
Mm.
things aren't moving as quickly as they are. Because I return to probably like my first comment of, people are emotional and we're not logical, and we can have a beautiful plan on paper that seems like it's got no holes in it, but the minute you start to roll that out, all of these things kind of come out of the woodwork, and people are kind of reacting in certain ways, and um, try to keep that balance between those two pillars of not too slow, not too fast.
Yeah, I think you're really onto something that a lot of people who work in DEI in particular, I think, are so emotionally interwoven with the topic because of their own personal lives and their personal experience, and that makes it really
Yeah,
hard. It's not just a job for them, so then they don't when they don't see the progress that they want to see for them and for society,
yeah,
I imagine that hurts. So I think it's really good advice around sort of learning to detach enough to look after yourself while simultaneously not taking our eyes off the ball and just going, oh well, this is the way it is and this
yeah.
is the way it always has to be. Again, it's about that sort of it's delicate balance again.
Mm.
It's that word again, delicate. I really like that. So if that's something that you wish you'd known and something you'd share to perhaps other people in the industry, what about a big myth? So something that you hear a lot of around the industry that you just think is something that you don't necessarily agree with, something that you believe to be a myth.
I don't know if it's a myth, but I have heard this a lot recently. It's that culture just happens, or it's like a byproduct of something else. And I think, you and I were kind of talking about the quotes that kind of we hear about culture, but it's that to me feels very much like, um, when you watch these films and uh, about these romantic relationships, and it's just because these people are in love and they don't need to do anything like to work at it, and anybody that's been in any relationship for a number of years knows that it takes work. That what you see on the surface that is kind of like is you and your partner going out with friends, and they're like, oh, you're so great, you're like, it's just hard, it takes work, there's so many things that you're having to dismantle, and you have to have there's a reason that a relationship is called a commitment, and commitment is kind of the thing that I want people to understand about culture. It doesn't just happen, or the cultures that just happen are usually bad cultures. There are the kind of the toxic ones because they've not been um, we've not really been looking after them, we've not been tending to them, or nurturing them, a bit like a garden as well. Like all of these analogies are used for all the different things, aren't they? And I have heard it actually quite a lot this year, since January, that we'll do good work and the culture will take care of itself. And I'm like, it's literally the complete opposite. Like, you have to make a line in the sand of, this is something that is a priority for us to change, and we're going to understand how we're going to do it, we're going to invest time and money into it, and we have to continuously work at that, to the point where, and it sounds really severe, but if you have managers on any level that are not following those values, or the culture that you're setting, they can't be within the organization. We see organizations a lot kind of excusing behavior because of top performance. I'll go back to my examples in corporate media, and I literally heard about people throwing objects, like managers throwing phones, when we used to have those big phone handsets, like across the room at someone because they hadn't. And I can't believe that story was told like in my working lifetime, but it was just that person produced good results. So it was almost taken to mean, well, good results equals okay behavior. And it just sets a tone. So never, just don't think that culture just happens, because that is a surefire way to create a really toxic culture.
Yeah, I think the phone throwing example is an interesting one because I imagine that happens relatively rarely, but I think what probably happens every day is that, but just on a slightly smaller scale. Maybe someone's not throwing a
Yeah.
phone, but they're doing something else that is just countercultural. I think the distinction I would make on the culture piece is culture grows culture happens if you put three people in a room, a culture will form between those people. That is inevitable. And then we have a choice on whether it grows by design or by default. And if you just leave it, it'll grow by default, and you might get lucky and it will be good, but it's, as you say, incredibly unlikely. It's more likely to be bad. Or you could purposefully create structures around it and invest time and effort into it so that you actually design it in a way that it sort of goes into the direction you want. So the metaphor I've got in my mind is funny you say gardening, because plants, because I had a similar thing in my mind. It's almost like a plant will grow if you put it into soil, but the direction it grows you can influence. You can't completely control it, but with a trellis, I don't know if that's the right word, I'm not a gardener, but you can start to shape the direction that the plant goes in. And it's a similar thing with culture. You can put in place things that influence the direction it goes in, right?
Can I just add to that, Matt? I know, but I think it's a really important point that just because you have shaped your culture, it doesn't mean that it can't change if you take your eye off it. And what I see a lot of times happening is that classic example of a startup company that's got a really, really gorgeous culture. You know, they've got 5 people and everyone's kind of in it and everyone's kind of pulling for each other. And, you know, we're working really late nights, but it doesn't matter because we're all like, you know, in it together. Da, da, da. And then this startup kind of grows and gets really successful. And then really, really quickly, it becomes like 50 plus people. And because nobody has consciously gone, this culture cannot sustain, then, you know, senior leaders are looking around and like, well, what happened? Like maybe, you know, they'll blame the hiring of the people, or that, you know, they'll blame this. Whereas the reality is, you know, your culture will change as you grow. And if you don't keep an 100%. Eye on it and purposefully direct and shape it, it will fall apart.
Yeah, totally agree. So to take the plant example, it's not putting the trellis up in year 1 and then going, oh, well, it's continuing to monitor, is that plant going in the right direction? It's continuing to monitor your culture. And I think the example you provide is such a good one because it's so common. You know, when I was at Lane 4, the term that was used was like growing pains. When I joined, there were 60 of us. Then it grew up to over 200 people, and it's, you know, it became a place where you didn't necessarily know everyone in the office at times, and you know, that is different. It has different cultural challenges, and your culture will need to evolve, and that's good. But it's about doing it deliberately and trying to monitoring culture as it goes along. It's also not about trying to cling to the past and go, well, because as you get bigger, you can't. It's not feasible, right? So anyway, the last question I want to ask you is a question that I ask all my guests, which is about a culture hack that you love. So it's something that perhaps takes relatively little effort, but can make a big impact.
Yeah, really, really great question. And I go back to kind of what I said about keeping things simple. This culture hack, actually, I can't take credit for. It was told to me by a friend of mine called Mamawa Toure. She runs a diversity and inclusion consultancy called Belonging. And one of the hacks that she advised doing is to, in every meeting, make a designated devil's advocate. And I really, really love this because I think a way to keep challenging your culture is you have to bring out the other side of it, the devil's advocate kind of side of it. But we fall so prey to groupthink, or we default to the most senior voice in the room, that actually someone could be having a really great counter to what you're saying, but no one, like, people are kind of scared to kind of voice it. But if you actively say in every meeting, you know, Matt, your role in this meeting is to be the devil's advocate. You take away that kind of personal, you know, we're talking about being delicate. You take away kind of that personal, what feels like a personal attack. And actually you're fulfilling a role. It might not even be your views. It's just you're purposefully thinking about what could be, you're normal. And
you're normalizing
if we can, that's a really, really easy, simple thing to do. And I would love it if especially senior leaders in every meeting could just say, right, it's your turn to be the devil's advocate. Rotate it as well. And then I just think it would be amazing at how quicker people and how much psychological safety you create about voicing probably a really important thing
Mm,
that could have easily been, avoided, but no one felt safe enough to kind of say that in the
mm,
room. And I think that is such a quick, easy win
yeah.
on how to shift culture quite quickly.
Yeah, nice. I like that. What I like about it as well is it's not an extra thing to do because you have meetings. It's just 30 seconds at the start. It's embedded within existing routines as opposed to it being another initiative or another thing we have to do. So it can be quite easily embedded. I like that. So I'm conscious of your time. We could talk about this all day. I'm just wondering, do you have any final reflections on our conversation,
Just thank
Yasmin,
you so
before we
much for having
close?
me along. I could talk about this forever with you. I think I just kind of reiterate and summarize a lot of the advice that we talked about today, which is try not to be overwhelmed with the concept of culture because it can feel intangible and it can feel like I don't even know what that means. Where do we start? Like we've
Mm,
talked about this before, Matt. It's an umbrella term that kind of encapsulates so many different things. So just think about the small
mm,
shifts that you want to see and start there, because where I've seen culture change done well is when it's kind of started small and kind of escalated and people feel like empowered to make those changes. So if we always focus on the scale of it, we'll never make the first step. So yeah, start small.
brilliant. Thank you. It's that whole thing of a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single
Absolutely.
step, or something like step, something like that. I don't know. I've definitely not quoted that correctly, but something along those lines. So, and from my perspective, I just want to say a huge thank you to you as well, Yasmin, for sharing your time and your experiences. Thank you so much. And if people want to contact you, what's
So
the
you
best
can
way to
find me
do
on
so?
LinkedIn. If you just put Yasmin Alani into LinkedIn, you'll see a face that looks like mine. Really, really happy to connect with anyone. You can also contact me at MediaZoo at yasmin.alani at mediazoo.tv. Yeah, so happy to chat further and continue the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So that's it for today, everybody. If you like this episode, please do listen to our other episodes for more first-hand experiences and lessons on all things culture. Thank you so much for tuning in and go well, everybody.